words cut through the ballroom like a blade through silk. "Don't touch me, you stupid black girl." He didn't shout. He didn't need to. His voice was low, precise, cold, and it struck harder than a slap ever could. In an instant, the Four Seasons Beverly Hills lost its rhythm. The jazz band's final note hung in the air, suspended, trembling, then died in silence. Crystal glasses froze midair. Forks paused inches from lips. A single phrase had turned the hum of wealth and power into a cavern of stillness. Charles Drake didn't flinch. The billionaire CEO of Drake Nova Technologies adjusted his cufflinks with the same casual annoyance one might brush lint from a sleeve. Bordeaux bled slowly into the monogram of his $1,000 jacket, spreading like a stain that wanted to be remembered. He cared only about the wine, not the wound his words had carved into the room. Naomi Ellis stood motionless beside him, a folded cloth in one hand, a bottle of water in the other. Her posture was steady, her eyes lowered, her expression unreadable. She did not cry, she did not plead, she did not apologize. The silence around her was not weakness, it was armor. Every head turned, every breath held. And almost as if rehearsed, the glow of a dozen phones tilted quietly upward, recording the powerful men and women who filled the room. Titans of finance, media, and politics were suddenly spectators to a moment that refused to be hidden. Some looked at Charles with tight jaws. Others stared at Naomi, searching for her reaction. The air grew heavy, pressing down on every chest like stone. The insult hadn't just broken decorum. It had broken the illusion that power protects you from consequence. A server at the far edge of the room froze mid-step, holding a tray of champagne. An elderly senator shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his hand still gripping a fork he no longer knew what to do with. The band in the corner looked at each other, uncertain whether to play on or disappear into wallpaper. The room had become a photograph, every detail etched in perfect, damning clarity. Charles took a new napkin from the table and dabbed at his cuff with detached irritation. He didn't glance at Naomi again. To him, she had already vanished. To the room. She had never been more visible. A junior executive seated nearby let out a strained laugh, thin and nervous, like static in the air. No one joined him. Instead, the sound only deepened the silence. Naomi remained still, cloth poised but unused, her presence both invisible and undeniable. Her silence said more than any protest could have. It said she had heard this before. It said she understood what it meant. It said she would not give him the satisfaction of reaction. And yet this time was different, because the room had heard it too. Across the table, Elliot Strauss set down his fork with the weight of a gavel. He did not speak. He did not need to. His stillness was louder than applause, heavier than rebuke. His eyes, sharp as glass, lingered on Charles for a fraction longer than comfort allowed. No one in the room missed it. Phones vibrated silently. Messages were already being typed. Hashtags were already forming. The moment had been captured, not just on camera, but in memory, in reputation, in consequence. Charles thought he had ended it with a napkin and a dismissive glance. In reality, he had only begun to write the first line of his own downfall. The orchestra of murmurs started faint, then died again as Naomi finally stepped back. Her voice, calm and even, broke the paralysis without breaking herself. "Please enjoy your meal." Just 5 words. No tremor, no anger, no plea. And yet the weight of them lingered longer than Charles's insult. Because queens do not react, they remember. And when the time comes, they rise. The guests forced themselves back into small talk, but their words felt mechanical, brittle, like a broken clock still ticking. Nothing could erase what they had witnessed. The question now was not whether it mattered, but when it would matter. Something irreversible had already begun. And deep in the silence of that glittering room, beneath the chandeliers and the crystal and the careful laughter, every person present could feel it. A reckoning was coming. Naomi Ellis had not been born into the glittering chandeliers of Beverly Hills. Her beginnings were not polished marble floors and champagne towers. They were cracked sidewalks, running shoes worn thin, and a heart that beat faster than the stopwatch could measure. She had been a runner once, the kind who left spectators breathless and competitors chasing shadows. On the track she was fire, fluid and untouchable, her stride carrying her toward a full scholarship, a shot at the Olympics, a future that shimmered like a horizon she could almost touch. Coaches whispered her name as if it was already written on medals. Universities courted her with promises of facilities and fame. But life has a way of reminding you that dreams are fragile. Naomi was 17 when her mother's laughter turned to coughs and then to silence. Cancer came quickly, brutally, like a thief in the night. No warnings, no mercy. 1 month she was a mother cheering from the stands. The next she was a photograph on the mantle. Naomi stood at that funeral not as a daughter mourning alone, but as a sister clutching the hand of a 10-year-old boy with eyes too big for his body and legs that did not obey him. Elijah. Cerebral palsy had been his companion since birth, his wheelchair a chariot of both limitation and defiance. To Naomi, he was more than a brother. He was a promise. She would not let the world swallow him in pity. She would not let his light dim. That day she walked off the track, not because she was defeated, but because she understood something the stopwatch never could. Winning a race means nothing if you lose your family. Dreams of Olympics were replaced by the reality of overdue rent, medical bills, and endless therapy sessions. Naomi traded medals for double shifts, traded applause for exhaustion. She worked 3 jobs, 6 days a week. Some nights she stacked shelves until dawn. Other nights she folded linens in the back of a hotel kitchen. Sleep became a luxury she couldn't afford, but Elijah's smile made every sacrifice non-negotiable. He needed physical therapy. He needed a school that saw more than his chair. And Naomi needed to provide it no matter the cost. She never complained. She never begged. She never posted cryptic messages online about her struggle. She believed in quiet resilience, in carrying weight without an audience, in letting results speak where words fell short. Her beauty was undeniable, almond eyes that seemed to hold storms and soft skin that glowed even under fluorescent lights. But she never leaned on it. She let people underestimate her, let them dismiss her as just another waitress with a tray. Sometimes invisibility is not a curse. Sometimes it is armor, and Naomi wore it well. When she chose to work at the Four Seasons, it was not desperation that guided her. Easier jobs were available, quieter ones too. But Naomi understood something most people overlooked. Access matters. Power is not always visible on the front page of a newspaper. Sometimes it is whispered over a glass of wine, exchanged in a glance across a mahogany table, decided in silence by men who never looked the servers in the eye. By stepping into that ballroom with her tray and her uniform, Naomi was not surrendering. She was studying. She watched how arrogance dressed itself as confidence, how cruelty was applauded if it came wrapped in wealth, how kindness was rare but unforgettable. She was a student of human power, and every night she took notes not with a pen but with her eyes. Her shifts were her classroom, her tray, her textbook, every careless laugh from a man in a suit, every whispered negotiation over dessert, every insult muttered when they thought she was invisible, all of it was knowledge. And knowledge, she knew, was leverage. Naomi's strength was not in how fast she could run, but in how patient she could stand, how she could absorb humiliation and still move with grace, how she could hear a slur and not let it define her, only remind her that dignity is not granted, it is chosen. She walked among billionaires and senators like background music, present, essential, but overlooked. But she was never truly invisible. She was preparing for the moment when silence would no longer be enough, preparing for the instant when her stillness would mean more than any scream. Naomi did not choose the Four Seasons by accident. She chose it because she wanted to see men like Charles Drake with her own eyes. Charles Victor Drake believed in control the way other men believed in God. At 38, he had clawed his way from a cramped college dorm room to the penthouse suite of power. Drake Nova Technologies was his empire, a billion-dollar giant built not on kindness or collaboration, but on fear. To his employees, he was less a leader and more a storm warning. His name carried weight in boardrooms, not because it inspired admiration, but because it promised consequences. Charles liked it that way. He wore ruthlessness like a tailored suit. To him, hesitation was sin, weakness was rot, and people were disposable tools. If a project failed, he cut the team. If someone stumbled in a meeting, they were erased before the next quarter. Loyalty meant nothing. Results meant everything. Inside the gilded walls of the Four Seasons that night, he moved as if the room itself belonged to him. He didn't thank the servers who refilled his glass. He didn't nod at the staff who cleared his plate. When Naomi approached, he didn't even glance at her face. His hand flicked lazily, a gesture that dismissed her existence as if she were nothing more than background static. His attention was reserved for the men across the table, men with portfolios fat enough to feed his empire and egos sharp enough to match his own. He leaned forward with the confidence of a man who had never been told no. Every word he spoke dripped with certainty. He was not here to ask for investment. He was here to dictate terms. Charles had learned long ago that fear was a faster motivator than vision. He didn't bother with charm. He didn't bother with grace. He closed deals the way generals win battles, by leaving the other side with no alternative but surrender. His laugh was too loud, his anecdotes rehearsed. His language calculated to remind everyone that he considered himself inevitable. Even as wine dripped into his cup and humiliation should have cracked his mask, he pressed harder into his pitch. His arrogance was not shaken. If anything, it swelled, like a gambler doubling down after a losing hand. He saw people as chess pieces, each one placed, moved, or sacrificed depending on the board. Elliot Strauss across the table was the king he needed to capture. The investors at his side were rooks and bishops, their movements useful only so long as they served his ambition. The waitstaff, the musicians, even the junior executives fidgeting with their ties, pawns, irrelevant, expendable. Charles never looked at pawns. He believed he had outgrown humility. In his world, there were only two kinds of people, those who controlled the board and those who were moved across it. Tonight he intended to prove once again that he was the master of the game. What Charles did not understand, what his ego could never allow him to see, was that the smallest piece on the board sometimes holds the power to end it. He thought Naomi was invisible. He thought she was background. But he was wrong, because pawns can rise. And one pawn was already moving into position, ready to rewrite the game he thought he owned. Elliot Strauss was not a man who needed to speak to be heard. At 72, his silence carried more weight than most men's speeches. He sat across from Charles Drake that night, his posture upright but unassuming, his expression calm, almost unreadable. To the untrained eye, he might have seemed like any aging investor enjoying another dinner under chandeliers. But to those who knew, his presence was more than wealth. It was gravity. He was the kind of man who could tilt the axis of an entire market with a nod. Strauss Holdings had backed companies that became legends and buried others that tried to cut corners. His fortune was vast, but his reputation was larger. He was not feared like Charles. He was respected, and that difference made him infinitely more dangerous. As Charles spoke louder, pushing his pitch with the aggression of a man trying to prove he still held control, Elliot remained still. He did not interrupt. He did not encourage. He simply watched. And in that watching there was judgment. His eyes wandered not just to the man across from him, but to the young woman who moved through the room with quiet precision. Naomi Ellis, in her crisp uniform, hair tied neatly, posture perfect, carried herself with the grace of someone who knew invisibility was her disguise. To most of the guests, she was background. To Elliot, she was something else entirely. He noticed how she offered a gentle smile to the elderly couple seated 2 tables over, how she crouched to retrieve a crayon a child had dropped and handed it back without drawing attention to herself. He noticed how her steps were measured, not rushed, how even in the midst of tension she never faltered. To Elliot, small acts revealed more truth than grand speeches. He had lived long enough to know that character is not declared, it is displayed. And Naomi displayed it in every quiet movement. The room carried a strange tension, one Charles was too blinded by ego to feel. The investors at the table shifted uncomfortably, sensing something unspoken pressing down. They tried to nod at Charles's promises, tried to smile at his forced confidence, but their eyes drifted toward Elliot, waiting for his cue, watching his silence. Because when Strauss withheld his words, it was never accidental. It was strategy. Elliot remembered his mother's lesson from post-war Berlin. When someone shows you who they are, believe them the first time. Tonight, Charles Drake had shown everyone exactly who he was. And Elliot believed him. He believed the insult had not been a slip of temper, but a revelation of character. He believed the hand that grabbed Naomi's wrist had not been impulse, but instinct. And instinct, Elliot knew, could not be hidden by a press release or smoothed over by numbers. It was permanent. It was damning, so he waited. He let Charles talk himself into louder tones, let him bury himself under layers of arrogance. He did not raise a hand. He did not whisper yet, but the decision was already forming. The power in the room was not in Charles's volume, or in his suits, or even in his billion-dollar company. The power was in Elliot's silence. A silence that said, I saw everything, and I forget nothing. To the cameras capturing every flicker of expression, to the guests pretending to eat though their appetite was gone, to Naomi herself who stood with quiet strength at the edge of the storm. Elliot's presence was a shadow stretching long across the table. Charles thought he was speaking to impress a king. He didn't realize he was standing in court. And the judge, though quiet now, was preparing to deliver a verdict that would change everything. The dinner moved on as if nothing had happened. At least that was the illusion everyone tried to maintain. Plates of roasted duck appeared, sauces drizzled in delicate spirals, and glasses of Bordeaux refilled, as though the insult had been folded neatly into the linen napkins and tucked away. Conversations restarted, mechanical and brittle, a forced rhythm meant to drown out what everyone had just witnessed. But the air never loosened. It clung heavy to the chandeliers, to the silverware, to the backs of throats. Every smile looked rehearsed, every laugh too sharp. The memory of Charles Drake's words hovered above the table like smoke no one could wave away. Naomi moved through it all with the same quiet grace. She served Strauss first, then his aides, then the surrounding investors, placing Charles's plate last with a precision that looked effortless but was deliberate. She did not flinch under his gaze. She did not return it either. To her, service was ritual, and rituals were best carried out with dignity. Elliot Strauss watched her closely, noting the steadiness of her hands, the way her shoulders carried an invisible weight but never bent. Others at the table noticed too, though they dared not say it. Power was shifting, and no one wanted to be caught on the wrong side of it. Charles felt it. He would never admit it, but he felt it. The unease crept into the corners of his arrogance like water through cracks. He laughed too loudly. He pushed his pitch harder, leaning on numbers as if statistics could erase humiliation. He spoke about integration, about ROI, about doubling returns in less than 2 years. But his words fell flat. The investors nodded out of habit, not conviction. Their eyes kept wandering back to Strauss, waiting for his signal, reading his silence. Charles mistook their hesitation for distraction. And distraction was a sin he did not forgive, not in others and not in himself. When Naomi returned to refill the water glasses, her tray balanced perfectly, her expression calm, he saw not professionalism but intrusion. She reached for his glass, her hand steady, her motion flawless. That was when he struck. His hand shot out, fast, deliberate, wrapping around her wrist with a grip that was not violent enough to bruise, but strong enough to send a message. The cloth in her other hand trembled, not from her, but from the jolt of contact. The room froze again. He leaned toward her, his voice low and laced with contempt. When real business is happening, you stand still like the help is supposed to. The words hissed between his teeth, thick with wine, heavy with disdain. His grip lingered, his knuckles whitening with the pressure of dominance. No one spoke. No one moved, but every eye turned. They had heard the first insult, now they saw the second. This was not a slip of temper. This was not an accident. This was who he was. Naomi met his stare. Her eyes did not dart away, did not shrink, did not break. They held his calmly, controlled, as if she was the one allowing him to believe he had power when in truth she had already taken it away. "Yes, sir," she said softly, her tone neutral but unbreakable. Then with a movement so gentle it felt like defiance carved into silk, she pulled her wrist free. No force, no struggle, no sound of resistance, just quiet reclamation of her dignity. She stepped back, placed his glass down without spilling a drop, and moved to the next guest with the same poise she had carried all night. Charles blinked, momentarily unsettled. He had expected fear, apology, submission. He had received none. It unsettled him more than defiance would have. Defiance he could crush, but dignity was untouchable. Around them forks hung midair. Investors exchanged glances. Strauss placed his silverware down again, a deliberate gesture that cut through the tension like a drumbeat. His eyes never left Charles. The silence returned, but this time it was different. It was not shocked silence. It was judgment. Phones tilted higher, messages flew faster, and the weight pressing down on Charles was no longer invisible. It was undeniable. He tried to laugh again, tried to resume his pitch, but his words felt brittle, breaking even as they left his mouth. The room no longer belonged to him. It belonged to the silence. It belonged to Naomi's composure. And it belonged to Strauss, who sat as still as stone, every inch the judge who had just seen enough. What had been humiliation was now exposure. What had been arrogance was now evidence. And what had been a dinner was now a trial. Charles Drake still thought he was playing chess, but everyone else at the table could see it now. The game had already turned, and the pawn he dismissed as background was moving into place to end him. The sound was small, almost delicate, yet it thundered through the room. Elliot Strauss set his silverware down, knife, fork, resting perfectly on the edge of his plate. The motion was unhurried, precise, but it carried the weight of a verdict. Conversations that had already been brittle collapsed into silence. Even the quartet in the corner faltered, bows hovering above strings as if frozen mid-breath. Every eye shifted, not to Charles Drake, still grinning too loudly, still trying to salvage authority, but to Elliot, the storm that had been gathering in stillness. The air grew dense, pressing down on every chest. No one moved, no one even dared to sip their wine, and then Elliot stood, slowly, deliberately, a man of 72 rising from his chair with the gravity of a judge entering the courtroom. It was not dramatic, it did not need to be. The silence that followed felt eternal, a pause stretched until it became unbearable. Charles blinked, his smile twitching at the corners. He tried to recover with another half-joke, another loud laugh, but no one laughed with him this time. The room had already turned. Elliot's presence consumed it. He raised his hand slightly, a gesture that did not command but invited. From the far edge of the room, Naomi stepped forward. No tray, no apron, no badge that marked her as staff. Only the quiet confidence of someone who had carried humiliation and chosen dignity instead. Her steps were steady, the click of her shoes soft but sharp against marble. Each one echoed louder than Charles's words. The guests shifted, confused, curious. A whisper rippled through the tables, quick and nervous, then stilled again as Elliot's gaze swept across them. Naomi stopped beside him, not behind, beside, equal. The silence stretched further, unbearable now, as if the entire room was holding its breath, waiting for the next note. And Elliot finally spoke. His voice was calm, even gentle, but it carried like thunder across the hall. "This is Naomi Ellis, my daughter." The words cracked the room like lightning splitting the sky. Glasses trembled in hands. Forks clinked softly against porcelain. The hush was broken only by the collective gasp, sharp and simultaneous, as reality crashed into the guests. She was not invisible. She was not background. She was the daughter of the man whose name could move billions with a whisper. Charles's forced smile collapsed into nothing. His lips parted, but no sound emerged. Elliot continued, his hand resting lightly on Naomi's shoulder. She chose to keep her birth name. She chose to work here not because she needed income, but because she wanted to understand how power treats those it thinks are beneath it. He turned his head slightly, letting his gaze land on Charles with the weight of a hammer. And tonight you all saw exactly that. The room buzzed again, but this time it was different. Not conversation, but reaction. Phones lifted higher. Screens glowing. Eyes darted between Naomi and Charles, between dignity and arrogance, between the quiet storm and the man already drowning in it. Naomi stood tall, her chin lifted, not triumphant, not gloating, simply present, seen. The investors whispered among themselves, calculations shifting in real time. What had been a simple dinner deal was no longer about numbers. It was about character, about principle, about the kind of truth that cannot be erased by strategy. Elliot's voice cut through once more, soft but immovable. "The girl you called stupid is the woman I raised to be wiser than most CEOs I have ever met." There was no applause, not yet. The silence that followed was sharper than clapping could ever be. It was the silence of realization, of judgment, of a verdict sealed in the presence of witnesses. For Charles Drake, it was the silence of a man watching his empire slip through his fingers. For Naomi Ellis, it was the silence of recognition, long overdue. The kind of silence that carries the sound of a future beginning. And for the rest of the room, it was the silence before thunder, when everyone knows the storm has finally broken. The fall did not come with a crash. It came with a vibration. Phones buzzing along the table, screens lighting up with headlines before dessert could even leave the kitchen. Strauss pulls out of Drake Nova deal. Tech giant faces backlash over racist incident. Investor's daughter insulted by CEO. The words spread faster than fire across dry brush. Guests shifted in their seats, chairs scraping back against marble. Some stood abruptly, unwilling to be photographed in proximity to Charles Drake. Others whispered into phones, their faces pale with urgency. A few simply walked out, their absence louder than any confrontation. The $3.5 billion deal, once the centerpiece of the evening, was dead before coffee was served. Outside the ballroom, journalists were already gathering, tipped off by the flurry of messages pouring out from within. Inside, Charles Drake's empire was unraveling in real time. His phone lit up with calls from board members, from legal counsel, from PR teams desperate to contain a flood that could not be stopped. Shares of Drake Nova plunged by 17% within the first hour. By midnight, it was down 22%, and the night was far from over. His company, once a fortress of innovation and dominance, was now a headline of scandal and disgrace. The sound of forks and glasses had been replaced by the staccato rhythm of fingers tapping at screens, investors divesting, allies distancing. Charles still tried to speak, tried to salvage authority, but his voice was drowned out by the silent verdict already cast. He stood in the center of the ballroom like a man abandoned on an island as the tide rose around him. The investors no longer listened. The waitstaff no longer bowed their heads. Even his own executives avoided his gaze, their faces already calculating survival in a world without him. Elliot Strauss did not need to say another word. His silence had already spoken louder than any statement. Naomi stood beside him, steady and dignified, the living embodiment of everything Charles had failed to understand. And the room knew it. They knew leadership when they saw it, and it was not the man sweating under the chandeliers. The board of Drake Nova did not wait for sunrise. At 11:47 p.m., they voted to suspend him. At 12:14, his access to the company servers was revoked. By dawn, Charles Drake was no longer the king of his empire. He was an exile, a cautionary tale replayed on millions of screens across the world. Videos of the insult went viral, clipped and captioned, dissected by commentators, shared in outrage, and remixed into memes that stripped him of the gravitas he had spent years manufacturing. His name, once a symbol of dominance, had become a synonym for downfall. The wine stain on his cuff had been the beginning. The stain on his legacy was permanent. On the table where it had all begun, the Bordeaux still spread slowly across the white linen, dark and unforgiving. No one rushed to clean it. No one tried to blot it away. It remained there, bleeding into the fabric, a red mark that grew and grew, impossible to ignore. Guests glanced at it as they left, the symbol of arrogance undone. A glass spilled, a word spoken, a hand that reached too far, and an empire that crumbled in hours. Charles Drake had believed power meant control, that fear was the currency of leadership. But fear is fragile, and control is an illusion. The room had seen through it. The world had seen through it. And now the empire he built on intimidation and ego was nothing more than a ruin of headlines and broken trust. Justice had not been delivered in a courtroom. It had been served at dinner, and the stain on the linen would outlast the meal, a reminder that arrogance has a price, and once it is paid, there is no refund. The cameras blinked to life, streaming her image to offices in San Francisco, to boardrooms in Singapore, to laptops balanced on kitchen tables around the world. For many tuning in, it was the first time they had seen her face beyond a viral clip, a blurry frame of a young woman standing in quiet dignity while a billionaire spat cruelty across linen and glass. Now she was no longer invisible, no longer background. Naomi Ellis stood at a podium in a tailored navy blazer, her voice steady, her presence undeniable. She began simply, "Yesterday I was called stupid, not because I made a mistake, but because someone believed their title made them more human than me." She paused, letting the words hang in the silence of the broadcast. Thousands of employees leaned forward, waiting. "I said nothing then, but today I choose to speak." Her eyes swept across the camera, as if looking at every individual listening. There was no anger in her voice, no revenge, only clarity. There is a difference between power and leadership. Power can be taken, leadership must be earned. I didn't take this seat, I was trusted with it, and I intend to honor that trust. The words spread like a current through the virtual audience. Some employees wiped tears they didn't expect. Others felt a pride they hadn't known was possible inside the walls of a corporation. Because in Naomi, they saw more than a new director. They saw themselves. They saw the waitress, the janitor, the intern, the overlooked voices that make the machine run. They saw a leader who understood them because she had been them. Naomi's tone never rose. It didn't need to. "I believe in companies where people are valued not just for what they produce, but for who they are. I believe every role deserves dignity, every title deserves accountability, and every voice, especially the quiet ones, deserves to be heard." The applause that followed was not polite, not corporate, but real. It echoed through hallways, through laptops, through the minds of those who had long forgotten what leadership sounded like. And it carried further still, beyond Strauss Holdings, into headlines, into conversations, into a culture desperate for reminders that humanity is not optional. Naomi stepped back from the podium, her message complete. But before the feed ended, she left them with one final truth. A truth sharp enough to be remembered, simple enough to be repeated, and powerful enough to outlive the scandal that had birthed it. Sometimes the most powerful person in the room isn't the one at the head of the table. It's the one clearing it. If you enjoyed this story, let us know in the comments. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories.